بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم.
Welcome back, everyone, for our continuing conversation, History in a Time of Genocide, with Dr. Ariel Salzmann. In our episode today, I wanted to follow on some points that had come up in our last discussion about the failures of emancipation on both sides of the Mediterranean and some of the consequences we were discussing, one of which you mentioned was waves of refugees fleeing violent pogroms that happen in the backlash to some of these attempts at emancipation and freedom that take place in the period of the 1890s forward. And so I'm wondering if we could talk about, since that becomes a persistent problem and a crisis, not only starting in the 1890s, but through both of the two world wars and in the aftermath of World War II. What are the kind of key points to consider about this history of refugees and displacement happening?
The 19th century really overall is this age of mass migration. I mean, it's just stunning, from the Irish migration fleeing the famine, forward, massive Jewish migration, 1840s, Japanese migration, South Asian migration. But the 1890s is a period in which in Russia, you don't have an emancipation program, so we should be clear there. It doesn't happen until 1917, till the Russian Revolution emancipates the Jews at that point. But there's just general, especially from Poland is the epicenter. And Poland is not a country. It's absorbed into 3 other countries. And the majority of Jews are located in that region. And there's massive migration from there, persecution, economic. In terms of Jewish migration, they're fleeing into Western Europe, including into England, and the majority are going to North America, U.S. primarily, the United States primarily. And then you have smaller groups from the 1890s onward, because of the pogroms, who are also being resettled with the support of Jewish philanthropy in Palestine. And truly, the sort of Jewish approaches in Europe to the problems facing Eastern European, Southern European Jews are very different. You have the Alliance Israélite in France that tries to assimilate Jews in place. And that's certainly what they were doing in the Ottoman Empire. They were asking Jews to learn Turkish, they wanted them to be like French Jews, where you had, other organizations, and other philanthropists trying to remove them from these contexts. So there were different approaches to the problem of Jewish persecution. And they also go back to, when the Ottoman Empire is already beginning to be dissolved and split apart in the 1878 in Berlin. This is when European powers basically get together, roll back some of Russia. Russia had won a war in 1878 against the Ottomans, taken over a lot of the Black Sea region, made a super big Bulgaria. And in the Congress of Berlin, the European powers scaled back. Bulgaria made it semi-autonomous, still under Ottoman rule, but created new kingdoms. And 1878 becomes really the blueprint for what will happen at Versailles. So they recognize a series of new kingdoms they're only Christian, out of the Ottoman Empire. Only Christian states and statesmen need apply. Romania, Serbia becomes fully independent. But they're all charged they're supposed to create constitutions that will allow for Jewish and Muslim equal rights. None of them do. I mean, the end result is that they don't. Romania, for example, promises that it will create a constitution that will recognize Jewish equality and citizenship in Romania, and leaves them in limbo for decades. They're written out of the Romanian constitution, and both Germany and Italy, which are supposed to enforce these, just capitulate to the Romanians. So this creates new problems, new persecution, new flight from these newly formed nation states, and the failure of these sort of minority provisions in there. In the Ottoman Empire, there are also minority provisions for the Armenians in particular, because in the eastern provinces, in the even before this period, they'd been subjected to violence. They had tried to gain equal rights, and local lords would repress them. And there was supposed to be a new formula for securing their rights, where the majority lived in these eastern provinces that were on the border of Iran and Russia. So throughout this region, both really in Russia and the Ottoman Empire, you're having these problems with minorities. The Balkans will be another place, repeatedly in the Balkan Wars, where Muslims will be pushed out in droves, in large numbers. They've already been pushed out of the Caucasus, so they're Circassians who are coming into the Ottoman Empire, and the Ottoman Empire becomes this refuge for the expelled Muslims. So when we're talking about refugees, we're not just talking about Jews, and we're not just talking about Christians. We're talking about large numbers of Muslims who are being expelled from these newly formed Balkan states. In Serbia, they were expelled in a series of moves. When Serbia got autonomy, they were prevented from living in rural areas. When Bosnia was absorbed by Austro-Hungary, there was also a flight of Muslims. So Muslims are a big part of the refugee populations, but most of them don't go westward. They're going into the Ottoman Empire. And I don't think we should or can forget this when we're thinking about Ottoman reactions to non-Muslims, that there's already been this history of persecution by these newly formed Christian states to Muslims and older states like Russia. And there's a lot of resentment within the Ottoman Empire among these refugee populations who will be settled in targeted areas, often among Armenian populations in the East, and leading to all sorts of problems that we'll see later on. The first illustration, I think, the Balkan Wars of 1912, 1913 become another epicenter of massive repression against civilians, massive flight of Muslims. Christians are murdered, Muslims are murdered. It's the first time that a organization actually conducts a relatively objective study of what happens in war, and that's the Carnegie Foundation, founded by Andrew Carnegie, supposedly pursuit of peace. He's the anyway. So and there's a study shown of how many people are displaced, how many people are persecuted, how many villages are destroyed during the war, and even the Ottomans regard this as a relatively objective report. The Jewish population of Thessalonica ends up in Greece at this point, and Virginia Woolf's husband, Lucian Woolf, who is an advocate for Jewish rights, tries to intervene with the Greeks to make sure that the rights of this very unique Jewish community, the Sephardic Jewish community that lived there for 400 years, are protected, and he's completely rebuffed by the Greek ambassador. So you can see how tensions are just ratcheting up in this period between the 1890s and World War I. And what will happen in World War I, and I have my first photograph that you'll see, is of Armenian refugees in Aleppo after 1915. Many of them women and children. Many of the men have been systematically slaughtered. before, in on site or en route, but usually on site before they even join these caravans of the dispossessed after 1915 and onward. So it produced these persecutions and these exclusionary state projects. The nation state produced this new wave of refugees around Eastern Europe in the Ottoman Empire in the aftermath of the war. The Greeks are displaced. The Greeks invade in the aftermath of World War I, after the first armistice, and then a new set of pogroms and retaliatory attacks occur, ending up with the mass expulsion of thousands and thousands of Greeks from what remains the post-Ottoman state. So the refugee crisis only accelerates before, during, and after the war. And I think we have to think about this refugee crisis as one of the agents in this modern history. With one refugee crisis, with the persecutions bleeding into genocide in the case of the Ottoman Empire, and retaliatory pogroms in the Caucasus, in Southeast Europe, and then leading to new sorts of interventions, which are not very successful and are usually done with this imperial heavy hand of the West, whether it's in the Ottoman Empire or whether it's in Southeastern Europe in these new states, and are viewed with resentment because of that. And then leading into more persecutions, another genocide, and then more refugees. So I think there's a dynamic in and of itself, and I don't say it's.
You mean in World War II, when you said
No, well,
yet another?
starting in the 1890s,
Mm-hmm,
going into World War I,
mm-hmm.
and then in the interwar period, and then going toward World War II and its
Yes,
aftermath in
yes,
Palestine.
yes, yes.
So what I'm trying to isolate is this other force in this modern history that leads out of the failure of emancipation, the exclusionary nation states that are formed in the aftermath, and this cycles of persecution, expulsion, mass murder that lead to, in many ways, that are a force onto itself, leading to the dispossession of yet new populations, um, including, and of course, the Palestinians themselves after 1947, 48, 49, the Nakba, and then 67, the Naksa. Um, so, so that's what I want to focus on, and as having this other logic that's part of the forces that come together that will dispossess the Palestinians in its wake.
Mm-hmm.
So, as I said, I start with this photograph, 1915, and that's one of the reasons that Syria is so diverse now. It had an indigenous, Greek Orthodox, Malachite population in Aleppo, but it also had increasingly these numbers of Armenians. The Armenians are a very large, important population within Syria, but they're the refugees from 1915. So the one force, so you have the persecutions bleeding into genocide, and then you have, what happens in after World War One, in these decisions that are made by the victorious allies. So we talked about it in the last episode. The result is the betrayal of the Arabs and the creation of a new colonial framework within the Middle East, of which Palestine is hived off, of course, from Syria, controlled by the British, Syria and Lebanon by the French, Jordan, this entity called Jordan, then ruled by the British, as well as Egypt and Iraq. So there's that situation that comes in, that creates this massive unhappiness, of course, among Arabs who are thrown in their lot with the British. And there's also an effort to either reconfigure or reconsecrate the Southeastern European states. So that's also comes out of Versailles. And it's important to recognize that duality, that on one hand, Muslims are given mandates, and Southeastern Europeans and Eastern Europeans are given states, are given nation states. And in that new configuration that comes out of Versailles and the League Charter, there's a condition, a proviso put in to the new Eastern European states. Poland comes back together for the first time in 300 years or so. And all these states, beginning with Poland, are also charged with maintaining the equal rights or the special rights of their minority populations. Now, minority acquires yet another characteristics: linguistic and ethnic. So minorities are also Germans living in,
Czech,
Eastern Europe,
Bohemia.
Europe in Czech, what becomes Czechoslovakia. Yugoslavia is a new state, again, supposed to protect its minorities. Poland, in particular, Jews are singled out. Poles are very angry about it. They're very indignant that they're subject to what they consider to be a sort of Ottoman-like humiliation, and not being civilized enough to act responsibly like Western Europeans, when in fact they're right. They were the ones who took in European Jews for hundreds of years while they were cast out of England and France and Germany. But it creates this whole nother wedge issue within domestic politics and within international politics. And so this whole new framework is set up that will contribute to not the resolution of this inequality between an exclusionary nation state and minorities, but its aggravation in many respects. At the same time, the deliberate Wilsonian breakup of all these multi-ethnic, multi-religious states, like Austro-Hungary, like parts of Russia, and the reuniting of Poland, will create new waves of refugees. And it's one of the biggest refugee crises, before and after the war, one of the biggest refugee crises for the Jewish population. But the regulation and the thoughts on minorities don't end there. And I would like to just talk about, before I talk about the restraints to migration, I would also like to just conclude with the last of the World War I treaties, and that's the Treaty of Lausanne, which I think undercuts every framework, all that was tried, what Wilson and the altruists tried to create out of the League of Nations Charter, and with respect to minority rights. So in the minority rights charter, in the minority sections or rights sections of the League of Nations, it only sees minorities as a category, but doesn't respect. Wilson tried to put in a clause that would respect the rights of religion, and that's rejected. And interestingly, it's rejected by the Greeks, who say we don't want this. And the Japanese put forward, a clause. They want a clause against discrimination on the basis of race.
Mm-hmm.
And the Americans reject that.
Yeah.
So you can see already the limitations to the notion of minority. And of course, there are many protests by African Americans in this whole thing. And the Greek and the Japanese proposal is actually very, very significant and should be remembered. But the undoing of even the limited minority provisions that were proposed in 1919 and imposed on these new states would be found at the Treaty of Lausanne, because the Europeans, not satisfied with just the defeat of the Ottoman Empire, actually want to divide up what would be left of what is today Turkey, dividing it into an Italian part in the south, in the Mediterranean portion, and in the Aegean portion, basically giving that over to Greece, and something that didn't come into being, but an Armenian mandate that they wanted the Americans to take over. The Americans refused. Of course, they didn't become part of the League of Nations and, went into their isolationist mode. So that never happened. But in the meantime, the Russians basically took control over the Caucasus. So the Treaty of Lausanne takes place in this completely new framework where the Russian Revolution has largely succeeded, especially in the Caucasus region, giving the post-Ottoman forces a sort of buffer zone against Britain. In the east, the Armenian genocide has stripped that region of its very large Armenian population. We don't have exact figures, or over 1 million Armenians had been killed in that process. The rest had been expelled. And they, in turn, receiving help from the Soviet Union, from Lenin, are able to push out the Greeks. And so by the time they arrive at the penultimate treaty in 1922, 1923, they're in a totally different position than the Arabs were. And they've conceived of a state which is, at that point, unclear whether it's a purely ethno-nationalist project. They don't want to really show their cards, but it's the ethno-nationalists who are controlling the political thing, chief of whom is Mustafa Kemal, aka Ataturk, right? So they show up at Lausanne, and in the first part of the Lausanne negotiations, the minority treaties come up. And they basically are able, after realizing, and I don't think they fully realize that ethnicity as well as sectarian differences like being Shi, Alavi, could also be written into the new charter for the post-Ottoman state. They were able to scale back the minority treaties just to recognizing the old religious minorities, Jews and Christians. And so that was it. But in doing so, in negotiating that, they basically forced the Europeans to show their hands. And what they showed at Lausanne, and that was clearly noted by the Poles who sent a representative, by all, the Indians sent a representative because Indian Muslims were very concerned about the fate of the caliphate. So it was a global event, and it was all on display, the degree to which the European powers did not care about minorities. They used the minority card in such a cynical fashion that it was all about maintaining their privileges under the capitulations, whether it was legal immunity or low tariffs. That's what they were concerned about. Paying back the Ottoman debt, getting more territory to sort of finish off, the French in Syria, and pushing British mandate in Iraq into Kurdish areas, Mosul, and bringing that down. So that's what they were concerned about. And it became very clear that what the Ottomans were, the post-Ottoman, I call them, the Ankara delegation, was able to show the absolute hypocrisy of the minority treaties and the craven imperial aims of the Allies. Basically undermining any good, as far as I can see, that came out of the League of Nations and these whole negotiations around minorities. And indeed, it would be the Turks to be the first group to basically put the minority treaties to their test. And by 1927, they had forced first the Jews, then the Armenians and the Greeks. They had given them a Godfather proposal, which is you either accept your protections under the minority treaties and under the League of Nations, which allows for third parties to take violations of the treaties to the League of Nations and seek some sort of redress for you. You either keep those protections or you keep your citizenship in the new Turkish state. And so they were given this, ultimatum, and they all capitulated. All the groups capitulated and renounced their minority rights. So I think this is a very significant moment because all the other states that had seen the imposition of this sort of caveat on national self-determination, they saw the minority treaties as, yes, you're free to determine yourself, except you're beholden to an extraterritorial multinational body, which is largely controlled of Western states. When it comes to this portion of your population, they saw it as potential fifth columns in terms of, territoriality and loyalty, et cetera, et cetera. It, it festered resentments. I'm not saying that it was unnecessary, but its negative impact was so great in this period, and in the way that a new state Poland came to see its minority populations, or a new state Turkey saw its minority populations. So I think this is very significant in the interwar period.
Well, do you think that there is a direct continuity, but just under a different aegis, between that 19th century era of British, French, and Russian kind of immunities and carve outs under the guise of saying that we are, having to protect these religious minorities in the Ottoman Empire, because the Ottoman Empire can't be trusted to, exercise sovereignty and judicial, impartiality and so on over populations that are not of the same religion and the same kind of, ethnicity. In other words, that you can't have a multi-religious and multi-ethnic society. You're not capable of organizing one, and the only legitimate citizens you could have under your sovereignty have to be, Muslim, for
Oh,
example. And then,
religions.
and then that has just been secularized into the ethno-national determinations under the League of Nations paradigm, where, okay, the Muslim is now the Turk. And so as a result, you can have your sovereignty for your fellow Turks, but you have to act in a nation state. It's a multi-religious society, so there has to be some mechanism for extraterritorial sovereignty. International institution has to be able to limit your state's governance over these populations in various ways.
Yeah, and you
Seems
think
very
about it the
parallel.
long term. Yeah, no, it is parallel, and you think about it over the long term, and how what a long term negative impact this has had on all multilateral attempts to legislate minority rights, whether they're women's rights, whether they're rights for LGBTQ, all of these things. Aside from whatever feelings those populations might have toward these groups, are all now seen as foreign interventions, and as means through which foreign powers, namely, imperial, post-imperial powers, have leverage into their sovereignty as states. And that's why I consider this Lausanne
Right,
moment
right,
so incredibly important in removing the mask, because who's facing off against the Ottomans is Lord Curzon, who the former viceroy of India, who's, in every possible moment, just utterly disdainful of the Turks, and just, talks down to them paternalistically and everything else, but is so clearly uninterested in the fate of minorities, and only too willing to raise the Armenian genocide when it suits him, to get other as a leverage for other things. Now, I also think Lausanne's very critical in that regard as well, insofar as Lausanne would have been the opportunity to actually hold the future Turkish state accountable for what happened to the Armenians. And don't forget, there's a question of death, and we see this now in Palestine. There's a question of expulsion. There's a question of death, of mass murder, of incredible harm and trauma. And there's also the question of property. I mean, what happened in the late Ottoman Empire and the early Turkish Republic is, as one historian has put it, the Turkish Republic got a dowry in the form of untold land, property, factories, goods, personal belongings of this very middle class, lots of peasants, but also lots of urban elites population. It was all recycled into the Ottoman Empire. I mean, I think it ended up basically underdeveloping the Ottoman East because they removed this very entrepreneurial class that was just ripped out. And those Turkish elites who were aligned with the Young Turks could not fill their roles. They didn't have the techniques and the skills and the connections to make good of all these properties that were left, including factories, small factories that the Armenians left. But it was this incredible transfer of wealth. And that's exactly, people talk about it intermittently, but when we talk about what will happen to the Palestinians, 47, 48, 49, the property, what is it? 87% of the mandate will be taken over by Jews, and they will take over Palestinian property, their land, their houses, their personal goods, their libraries. And when you start doing the calculation, and reparations was discussed in the immediate aftermath of the Nakba, but was never realized. And the amounts of money we're talking about, and I'll talk about it in a future, episode, it's just enormous. I mean, it was equivalent to or greater than the Israeli GDP at a certain point when you account for inflation. So these kind of transfers that happen with refugees, with genocide, are also part of the process of creating nation states. They're
Yes.
providing the material basis. And so that lack of accountability, of course, there were many colonial genocides, well into the 20th century in Africa, elsewhere. But this particular one was very well documented, and many of the Armenians actually even had insurance policies in the United States. So there were all these material and economic contingencies that were just ignored. And there was a possibility of holding, the future Turkish state accountable in some way, shape, or form, either for the genocide itself or for the massive expropriation of Armenian properties. And that wasn't done. And I think that too set a terrible precedent for the years to come. And certainly the framers of the Genocide Convention would go back to the Armenian genocide in thinking about how this played out. So there were many things. So in Lausanne, the future Turkish leaders of the future Turkish state walked away with the most minimal guarantees for minorities. They saw through what the Europeans were doing, that they didn't, forgive me, they didn't give a shit about what happened to them. That was only a rhetorical device to get the churches on board, to get the Pope on board, to put, screws on the delegation, humiliate them. And they didn't care about really establishing some sort of precedent about genocide, which, of course, until Raphael Lemkin came around, didn't have a name, right? It didn't have a name.
And well, a couple of things. One is, of course, one point that you're highlighting that has subsequent consequences is precisely the use of these interventionist modes and excuses for undermining sovereignty, whether it was in the 19th century to kind of pressure the Ottoman state into carving out into millets separately that has does a lot of damage to the idea of a coherent and cohesive polity and society. And then similarly here in the Lausanne kind of context is establishing this precedent of kind of imperialist intervention, even if it wasn't colonial in the same way that European nation states had subjected large parts of, Africa and other parts of Asia to colonialism. The Ottoman Empire at this stage hadn't been colonized, but they will actually essentially have colonialism under a different name for the mandate, the Arab territories, and even the state of the new Republic of Turkey is having to forge itself out of this kind of interventionist logic where the excuse or the historic kind of conditions of intervention on behalf of minorities as something undermining sovereignty and not in a good faith mechanism for preserving multi-ethnic, multi-religious polities, because that isn't even in the imagination of the political
Yeah,
of the Europeans
exactly.
anyway. It's just a mechanism for saying these are people who we have an interest in, and you are incapable. You have to have limited sovereignty because you're actually incapable of ruling over a multi-religious society, multi-ethnic society fairly, even though, one could argue the balance of history that we've been talking about in previous episodes suggests that, these Islamicate societies and other ones of the Mediterranean, old world system were much better at honoring rights and were more
Accommodating, yeah.
cosmopolitan and, were able to kind of reconcile differences in various ways much more successfully than European ones were as they forged nation states, but that this nationalist imagination, once exported into the successor states of the Ottoman Empire, produces all these major problems because an atmosphere of hostility that amounts to violent persecution of these minorities, of these different communities and populations. So one through line is this: that then subsequent to this, there's never really going to be acceptance of some kind of broader multilateral intervention, because it's seen as just a tool used, as it has been used in the past very cynically, whether it's imperial feminisms or it's, responsibility to protect in the more recent period. So that's one thing that
But
poisons.
the other side too is, of course, what it does to the minority, the imagination of peoples who become minorities,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
It's like, where do they turn?
Yeah.
You
They don't
know,
feel they belong in that new
right?
national
Well, they
state,
don't
and they
feel they
have these
belong, but they
cosmopolitan
also
dimensions.
feel that they have to turn to the imperial powers,
Yeah.
and
That's
that's
right.
where, you know.
That's right.
So, or you know, in some cases, they create new notions of nationalism, like Baathism in its origin, that are, try to reforge the Islamicate
Hmm.
in new ways, and I'm not saying Baathism was successful either, but
Right.
in
Right.
origin, it came out of a minority imagination, right?
Well, yeah, Christian Arabs,
Yeah,
we're
yeah,
looking for what is a framework out of which, we can be equal citizens, right? And so that you do have that. I mean, Arab nationalism in general, you
yeah,
might say, I
yeah.
mean, is that trajectory, and it's something that's turned to initially by Christian intellectuals and intelligentsias who are looking for a political framework in which they can have equal rights with a Sunni Muslim majority in most cases. But so that's quite an interesting kind of issue or problem or legacy of this Lausanne
Well,
framework.
it's the Versailles, yeah, it's the Versailles Lausanne, minority dilemma,
Yeah, yeah,
that's created, and which, poisons, future multilateral efforts to advocate for, you know, persecuted groups in different countries. And we see that, of course, going today, whether it's Uyghurs in
yeah,
China,
yeah.
Rohingya.
Well, one of the
So
other consequences, because you've mentioned displacement, and of course, it's, there's
yeah,
refugees,
yeah,
but displacement of populations is one of the other consequences of this. Is in the 20s, for example, with Christian Turks, right? People who are in Anatolia who become Greeks. They are people who may speak Greek. They may
yeah.
speak other languages too, as well as Turkish, but they're Christians. In Turkey, is that the secularization of a kind of Sunni Muslim identity into just ethnicity as Turks, right? So, and you mentioned the influx of these
But
populations.
that's what I omitted, and I should have mentioned, is the population exchange.
Transfer, yeah, I was just getting to that the
Okay,
Greek,
so but that's the
the
other thing that comes out of Lausanne, is
right.
that the one success is the forced migration, and it's justified by Nansen, who will also lend his name to the stateless passport that
Hmm.
people will have up
Hmm.
until, the 70s. I knew someone with an Anson passport.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So, creation, this sort of, well, they will never live together. They'll never be
That's
able to
right.
live together.
Yes.
So the only thing we can do is separate them.
And transfer
And
these
it was, yeah,
populations.
transfer
Yes.
the wholesale transfer of the
Yeah.
population. And of course, this met the approval of both the Greeks
Mm-hmm.
and Mustafa Kemal, who signed off on it.
Right. Right.
And that was the one thing that was settled,
Mm-hmm.
in the first part of the Lausanne Treaty.
Yeah.
And Nansen made his appearance and, basically pitched this idea and would go on and, of course, justify it. It was something to which later Zionists would actually
Oh,
investigate as a possibility. Yeah,
this is exactly what I was saying, is that this agreement that, oh, you can't have a multi-ethnic or multi-religious, and of course many of these people you wouldn't say are ethnically different necessarily, they just have a different religion, but that becomes
right,
ethnicized in this nationalist, secular nationalist ideology and framework for the nation state, is that no, they can't be mixed populations, they can't live there. So because there's a neighboring state, uh, they Greek Muslims have to become Turks, and they have to be, who are legacies of the Ottoman, experience. They have to be, in Turkey as Turks, and Christians living in Anatolia who may, ethnically speaking, be, indistinguishable from what is a Turk, during this period, because of course most of these Turks are not descendants of, Central Asian steppe peoples. They're the local population that over time, became Muslim and started speaking Turkish, and so on, that they have to transfer. This very same idea, of course, must be what is underpinning the idea that, well, the Arabs have their countries, they've got all these other Arab countries. And because these people are Arabs rather than, Palestinians, no local identity, they're part of this mass of people. So why can't they just be expelled and transferred?
fungibility. You
Fungible,
know,
yeah, just, they're
the
part of those people.
identity, yeah,
And the
fungible identities.
population exchange of the 1920s from this Treaty of Lausanne seems to establish that kind of
Well,
precedent of
again and
the
again, it
violent measures that
completely
could be taken. Yeah.
undercuts the whole idea that minorities can safely live within these future nation states.
Yes.
So on both sides, the fact that, the mask is down, the West doesn't care about minorities. Why don't they care? Because they let the Ottomans get away without even, any reparations, any acknowledgement. There's all this rhetoric and, accusations are flying and stuff like that. But nothing's written in the treaty. There's not a single mention Armenians in the treaty. They get away with anything. And then secondly, they capitulate to both the irident,
Nationalist.
yeah,
Yeah.
exclusionary nationalist
Yes.
agendas of both the Greeks and the future Turks. I mean, at that point, the Ankara delegation still has to pretend that it's representing Circassians and Kurds and
Hmm.
Alevis,
Hmm.
because it's still an amorphous in
Yeah.
terms of the actual identity and national identity. And in fact, it's very clear when you read the sort of basic principles of coalescence during this period, that they conspicuously avoid defining what is the future Turkey other than as the Ottoman Muslim population. That's what they call it. They do not, and then they contrast it with the Arabs, right? So the Arabs are clearly defined, but the Ottoman Muslim population, they can't narrow it down because they're still, not negotiating, but they haven't
Yes.
consolidated
Happy is
power
he who
yet.
says, I am a Turk, but we have no idea
That
what
comes
that is.
later. That comes later. That
Yeah.
comes later.
Yeah. That
That
comes
comes
later.
later.
But I mean,
Yeah,
that's,
because when they say that in the Büyük Meclis, in this period in the National Assembly, they get shot down by the Circassians who say, what's
right. Of
going
course.
on, and Laz and Kurds. So
Exactly.
they really can't do that. But that's why I'm saying Lausanne is really consequential for basically rolling back whatever could have been in the Treaty of Versailles. And the Treaty of Versailles, of course, and the League of Nations Charter could have been much more much more expansive in terms of protecting rights of religious nature and also anti-racist. If the Japanese had been listened to, and of course the Americans weren't there, because they were, Wilson was the first to veto that. So all of this is happening. So basically, they're creating situations where it's worse for minorities, not better for minorities. Minorities now being put on the spot. They're putting in this, very precarious position. And the Zionist operatives are in Turkey, working among Turkish Jews. It'll get worse in Turkey, in the Republic of Turkey, in the 1940s, when you have this basically this tax situation, which is put on small businesses, which basically ruins the remaining Greek, Armenians, and Jews. They lose all their property, and if they're not able to pay the tax, they're sent out to penal colonies. So there is this backlash that follows, even though these groups renounce whatever claims they have under the League of Nations to protection. So this migration continues in the interwar period, and especially after World War I. There's a real crisis of Jewish migration in particular. And this happens in the aftermath of 1905, when Balfour himself is one of the architects of the 1905 Alien Act, which is the first time the British actually set up, have real restrictions on political asylum. Before that, they had none. And, although people didn't come in droves, there was still a way to get into England from Eastern Europe, especially Jews. And 1924, when in a series of, blocks to non-European populations, or those populations were considered not sufficiently European, Southern European, Eastern European Jews, etc., that the doors in the United States are shut as well, which had been the most important outlet for Eastern European Jews up to that point. So it's right in the aftermath of the war. And so you can see why, given these kind of circumstances, even at that point, although the majority of European Jews would not want to go to Palestine, they did not see Palestine as a home or as an alternative. More would turn in that direction. And of those, much of the majority were Poles, because Poles were the most migrating people to begin with among the Jewish communities. And of course, the concentration of Jewish populations was there in Poland, this new Poland after the war. So this is the situation that minorities find themselves in, but Jews in particular find themselves in the interwar period. Even in countries like Germany, where they had once enjoyed, unprecedented degree of assimilation. It wasn't anti-Semitism free. There was backlashes against them, even in World War I, although they served in large numbers in the war. And in the Weimar period, they made certain advances. They were prominent even in government. But it's in this period, in a country that was experiencing grievance from the kind of indemnities that were put on Germany, destruction of its economy. Although, France in particular wanted its pound of flesh, and even occupied the industrial part of Germany, the Rhineland, as the Lausanne Treaty was being negotiated in the 20s. And so, increasing, and a country that had historically experienced centuries of anti-Semitism and pogroms before the sort of window of emancipation, Jews found themselves increasingly at the margins, and with the rise of explicitly anti-Semitic parties, including, and also part of, of waves of, and in the forefront of many of the leftist movements. So They were also, in addition to being seen as outsider, they were now also seen as Bolsheviks, right? And a threat, yeah, to the German polity and the German right. So it's in these, particularly in the 30s, that the situation in Germany becomes increasingly impossible for Jews, and yet they're shut out. And they're shut out everywhere. They're shut out of Western Europe, although some do eventually find refuge in France and Belgium. I had a distant cousin who left um, what became Slovakia, what Czechoslovakia, went to Belgium during these years, um, and then some in England, but very few, comparably. And by the 30s, and I have some of these slides. I mean, you have the migration restrictions in the United States from 24 onward. And then in the 30s, even as it becomes very clear that European Jews are facing, unprecedented prejudice, especially in Germany. It's 1935. They are stripped of their citizenship in Germany with the Nuremberg laws. There's Kristallnacht, where their stores are destroyed and they're attacked. And Hitler basically imposes, learning from the American South, Jim Crow, Jewish only benches, white German benches. They're removed from the universities. They're stripped of their jobs and incomes.
And interestingly, in this context, I mean, this is that nationalist logic that we had been talking about, where the presumption is that populations that have some kind of national or ethnic, religious difference, depending on how national identity is being defined, can't live together, is that this right-wing ultra-nationalist, German, nationalism conceives initially that, that one way to solve the problem is why don't we carve out from our war gains and territorial acquisitions through war in Poland is, why don't we kind of think of creating a special enclave where we can, dump Jews of Europe and have them have some kind of, polity there themselves. And you see that, that there's also interest in, before the final solution and genocide is, well, how about we, attempt like Balfour did, is like, instead of having Jews, in England, why don't we have them go to Palestine? And so there is attempts to try and resettle and expel. It's like the old story of expulsion, essentially expelling Jews from European territory or from a certain, kind of king's lands. Now, this is the case for the, consolidating nation state of Germany. Let's, send them, out. And so that's again this kind of pattern that we've seen. Germany is just a later kind of and very vicious expression of what you were just talking about. Essentially, was happening, with the consolidation of the Turkish state. Is that this pattern then repeats itself, that was emerging.
Well, I think it's also the impunity. I mean, and that's another thing. I think the dehumanization, the tying of minority populations to imperial, schemes of various sorts, whether it's Jews and international finance, and undermining the economy, or being a fifth column, and potential traitor as Dreyfus, because in his case, he's tied to Germany, he's associated as Alsatian. And, it's these kind of tropes, or Bolshevism, again, fifth column, Russia is going to, come in. But it's the impunity that begins with World War One. I would argue that World War One, and the failure to hold accountable for the Armenian genocide, which was something, which wasn't the first genocide in history, but it was one that actually had a potential for redress.
Well, when
whether
that
it was
happened in the
fair,
context of new nations being formed and established and being considered legitimate under a new international
withholding
system. Yes, that's right.
recognition, which is what they did in 1878, which is what they did in 1820, 30, and in and this growing sense that with in effect, World War One, although it became global, was the third Balkan War, and it came out of that unreconciled nation state formation in the Balkans, that trying to create out of very mixed populations these exclusionary, ethno-religious projects. I mean, religion was really a mix, in the mix there. It wasn't ever purely ethnicity, and I think that's another thing to underline, that throughout this period, there's no such, this pristine idea of the French Revolution bringing in the secular nation state model, was illusory in many respects. It had its moment with, a sort of revolutionary religion, but soon over. So yeah, so that's it, and so it's in this period that you have the doors closed for migration for minorities, in the 30s. Um, and it's during the 30s that again, German Jews are trying to flee. I do have, you can see a slide here of where just the Germans go. The Poles would take greatest victims in Poland after Germany invaded in 41, and they would set up many of the death camps there. But they'd also slaughter um, Polish Jews, with their mobile units. And so, a large percentage of Jews were just murdered on the spot. And as they moved into the Soviet Union, I think in 3 days in Babi Yar, they killed 30,000 people. And but in terms of where Jews found refuge, on the slide that I have there, you can see how, I mean, Iran should be mentioned. There was a whole group that fled across Russia and found refuge, Polish Jews in Iran. Some German Jews found refuge in the Far East, in Japan and China. But 1.5 million Jews found refuge in the Soviet Union too. So that should not be forgotten. But in terms of the Atlantic, which had the greatest possibility for absorption, granted it was still the end of the Depression, Depression hadn't fully lifted, it was Canada and the United States. And here, again, the what if. Um, Obviously, getting Polish Jews out would have been very, very difficult. But certainly, all the Jews, who had fled into Spain, France, England, or France, and the Netherlands. Netherlands had the highest percentage of Jews who were carted off to the death camps. These Jews could have been moved out and found refuge across the Atlantic, even if it was just temporary. And yet, in 1939, and I have a slide about that, when there was a poll taken to bring in 10,000 refugee children alone from Germany, most of whom were Jews, 61% of the population said no, don't bring them in, right? And only 30% said yes. And in Canada was the worst. And when Roosevelt proposed at Evian that the Jewish crisis be dealt with collectively by Western European states, Canada said no, none whatsoever. And again, you can see another slide there from the Canadian Jewish Archives about Quebec and a synagogue that's festooned with swastikas in 1938. So, I mean, this is the other part of the Holocaust that,
And it should be
okay,
mentioned, just on that point, it should be mentioned that there was a historic, long-standing Jewish community in Montreal that had been there from the earlier waves of Jewish migration. But during this period, when there was genocide taking place and there was a desperate need to resettle, you had this the doors being slammed shut by U.S. and especially Canada. So
Yeah, and then you got the overt, with Canadian officials supposedly saying none is too many. Their quote. There's a book by that title. But then you have this, if we want to fast forward, what's happening now in Canada, where uh, Palestinian refugees are supposed to be taken in, but someone's throwing wrenches in the machinery and making it nearly impossible for Canadian Palestinians to reunite with their relatives. Even though there's supposedly
this
this
program for
yeah,
family
program.
reunification. That's right.
Yeah, and when you look at just the German Jews, 60,000 of whom ended up. I mean, there were more than 120,000. I will give the exact numbers, but in that one slide that I have, 60,000 German Jews who ended up in Palestine during the war. Um, they were two-thirds of the amount of Jews who were admitted into the United States. I mean, how incomparable! Little
Hmm.
tiny Palestine
Yeah.
under colonial rule, being the only area that these Jews could go to. How many of them were confirmed Zionists? It's very unclear, or just desperate refugees, as opposed to 90,000, all this huge United States, no matter how uh, depressed it was during this period in the 1930s, surely could have absorbed, even as a temporary basis, far more Jewish refugees. And of course, there's the infamous story of the St. Louis, which was a ship of German Jews that boarded and were tossed. They refused in Cuba, and then traveled up the Atlantic coastline, being refused by the United States and then refused by the Canadians, and then finally sent back to Europe, where I think France, Belgium, and England eventually took in the majority, but then, at least more than 100 ended up in death camps. So, I mean, the fact that it's not, you know, uh, it's not just simply that the Holocaust, in many respects, made Israel, from many points of view, diplomatically, politically, demographically. It's the kind of reaction to Jewish and to refugee crises that I believe cemented the idea of an either or in the minds of many Jews of that generation, because the doors were shut. It's not simply the perpetrators. It's the fact that in genocide, as a genocide convention, there are people who are complicit. And those states that denied entry to people in the throes of this crisis should be considered complicit with the genocide. And I think,
I think
cemented
they
into
do,
place. Yeah.
actually, whether they recognize it in those terms. But I think one can say the West is complicit. And if you examine the geopolitical situation today, it's very hard to explain and understand the absolute uniformity among almost all Western governments for supporting and apologizing for and running cover, arming, the genocide that's taking place now. It can only really be understood by framing it as, uh, uh, a question or a problem of the West as a whole that has shared this history of exclusion, of anti-Semitism, of being incapable of incorporating minorities, of refusing refugee resettlement, and refusing to, as you said, make anyone pay a price for other genocides where there were opportunities to do so, and of the way in which a narrow nation state kind of political imagination has guided a lot of those decisions and exclusions, when transported in particular to the Middle East in the aftermath of the Ottoman Empire, which was a much more diverse, multi-religious, multi-faith, multi-ethnic, multi-linguistic kind of polity. And the inability to be able to imagine a democratic future for the peoples of the region, without having to segment them off in these, nation states, is a tragedy. It is
or
part.
the minority slash millet
That's right.
silo.
That's right. Or the minority millet silo. Exactly. That's right. Exactly. Because we see that kind of perpetuating itself in the ethno-national kind of structure of a lot of the 1948 Israel, basically.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it continues the millet system within Israel, but and anyway, the other slide that I have to show is what happens in the post-war period, and it's very interesting. I was reading the discussions by the Arab states with respect to the discussions on the partition of Palestine. In the post-war period, of course, there was another refugee crisis. There was, refugees all over. There was several 100,000 Jewish survivors who were in and displaced persons camps that no one wanted. They couldn't go back. People who tried to go back, Jews who tried to get back, were often killed. I know all of my family's property was just expropriated by the peasant next door, took over their house, my great grandfather's house, and everything. But the discussions are very interesting because they were very aware, the Arabs were very aware, not only that this was an injustice to Palestinians and that they weren't going to stand for it, turning over, 87% of the land proposed. Well, that was the eventual thing, but it was 2/3 something, and of course the best land for the smallest population. But they recognized that what the UN was dealing with at that time was a refugee crisis, and and they said it outright. Why can't these Jewish people be settled somewhere else? We recognize there's a refugee crisis in post-war. We recognize what happened, but there's no reason that these people should be sent to Palestine. And those, that discussion, that acknowledgement that the post-war period and the pre-war period had been a refugee crisis period that the West had not dealt with, had refused to deal with, and was now putting on the backs of people who had no hand in that crisis, absolutely no hand in that crisis. And you will hear, of course, over and over and over again in these sort of apologies for 1948, for the formation of the state of Israel. Well, they rejected us. Well, they wouldn't let us come in. That's not the point. They did. It's the rest of the world that failed to take up their share of the problem and their responsibility. And it was the post-war period in which, again, which was one of the largest refugee crises previous to the present day. Now we have exceeded that refugee crisis, the post-World War II, right? And it was that crisis that the formation of the State of Israel, the acceptance of a Jewish state in Palestine responded to. And it was one way that they got around talking about the other responsibilities that they bore, much of which wouldn't be acknowledged for decades later. I mean, it's just recently that Trudeau, has recognized, the St. Louis and all the other, rejection of minorities or coming in as immigrants, who are pushed away. So this has only been really, really recent. But in the immediate aftermath of the Jewish genocide, the Holocaust, the Shoah, that was the response to that crisis. And I, have up here the tally list from Truman of on that slide that you'll see of who votes for and against the partition of Palestine. But I would urge people to actually read, what some of the responses are. They have nothing to do with anti-Semitism. It's about a refugee crisis, and it's about a refugee crisis caused by the West. And of course, what will happen in the aftermath of that partition is giving license to these extreme forces within the Jewish community that have long desired to establish an exclusionary nation state project within Palestine as a settler colonial state. And they made their intentions known within the region from very early on, from their first land purchases onward, where they refused to allow Palestinian tenant farmers to come back and tend the land, from their police forces, which attacked, what had been established ways of interacting between communities, from their policies of Jewish only economies, so that Palestinian farmers and suppliers would be excluded from supplying Jews in cities and in the countryside, when their Jewish labor only policies, so that non Jewish laborers would no longer be hired, in farms. And then in the 30s, when basically the British enlisted Jewish militias and trained them to work alongside of them in repressing an anti-colonial revolt, which continued from 1936 to 1939. And these Jewish militias, which were, again, the basis for the future Israel Defense Forces and Haganah during 48, 49, would be armed, would be trained by British officers, many of whom had served in Ireland, the Black and Tan units, some of whom, like Ordu Wingate, were British Zionists, were Protestant Zionists, Christian Zionists. And these groups also during the war acquired more weapons. And so when the partition was announced, they were prepared and had already begun acts of terrorism to kill off anybody who tried to propose a peaceful solution, like Folk Bernadotte, to attack civil society centers like the King David Hotel, which was actually owned by an Egyptian Jewish family, and were ready to undertake the next step during the war of expelling and killing Palestinians in order to create an exclusionary ethno-national state.
Well, I think that's a good point at which to conclude this episode. We'll no doubt have to come back to a little bit of those events in the immediate context of the foundation of the State of Israel and what ensues as we go forward in this series.